Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Monday, March 25th. Good morning if you're listening to this in the morning, or good day wherever you're listening to it. As just got a quick hitter coming for you here today as we get this week started. Wanted to chat about a couple of things going on in and around college basketball. And let's just get started right off the bat, first of all, by saying that we are brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, tremendous specials coming down the pike, it seems like weekly from Home Field Apparel, and just a tremendous collection of mostly college apparel, but it extends beyond that. There's Colts apparel, there's Indy 500 apparel, there's a lot more out there. So check them out. Go to homefieldapparel.com, use the code HOME23, get 15% off your first order. Also, be sure to subscribe to Crimson Cast on Substack. It's free. Go to crimsoncast.substack.com. All right. Wanted to hit a few items this morning. And first of all, wanted to talk about what I'm going to call efficiency and aspiration as far as IU basketball is concerned. I hit this a little bit in a video that I recorded for Crimson Cast at the end of last week. One of the things that I've noticed, if you've been following along with what's going on in the NCAA tournament, is how well the top teams in KenPom are doing, and really the top teams in almost all of the advanced metrics. And that's not accidental. It does point the way, I think, for where IU needs to go with their basketball program and how far away Indiana is right now. And the big question, of course, is can Indiana find a way to fill the gap? With transfers, with late-breaking recruits, can they forge a team identity that's going to match what we're seeing at the highest levels of college basketball right now? So I'm sharing something on screen. It may not be that terribly visible, but we're going to give it a shot. What we've got here, as you see on the screen here, is the top, essentially 30 teams in KenPom. If I scroll down a little bit, you can see I get down to about the top 40. And you'll notice that there's only one team outside of the top 40 that is still in the NCAA tournament. That is North Carolina State, who's 52nd, who is the outlier in what I'm about to say. But everything else, you've got number 23 Clemson, you've got number 17 San Diego State, and then teams 1 through 14, with one exception, that's Auburn, are all still in the NCAA tournament. And what you notice when you look at these teams closely, and you really dig into the numbers, is that they essentially fall into two primary categories. You've got teams that are all around really good, teams that have both a high offensive efficiency and a high defensive efficiency, relatively speaking. So this is what I'm talking about, teams like UConn. They're second in offensive efficiency. That means that in terms of scoring the basketball efficiently, they are second in the country. And then they are also eighth in defensive efficiency. So not only do they stop the ball really well, but they also score the ball really well on their side. That ultimately is the teams that are going to have the most success in this NCAA tournament. We see it pretty much every year. You run down the list, other teams that really factor into both of those categories at a high level. You've got Arizona, who's 9th in offense and 10th in defense. You've got North Carolina, who's 16th in offense and 6th in defense. You've got Houston, who's 14th in offense and 2nd in defense. So those teams we see every year. It's no surprise that teams who are that good from an efficiency perspective are in. But what's also interesting is looking at the teams that are really, really heavily weighted one way or the other. So, for instance, Illinois has the best offense in college basketball. They have the 92nd best defense in the country. Alabama is kind of a more extreme carbon copy. They're 4th in offense and 101st in defense. On the flip side, you've got Iowa State, who's 49th in offense and 1st in defense. The reason I bring all this up, we've actually seen this with Indiana basketball in the past. Back to the 2012 season, that team was one of the best offenses in the country, and among the top teams, a pretty pedestrian defense. I think they were somewhere in the 60s. The next year, in 2013, that Indiana team was great all the way around. Great offense, great defense. So I point all this out because I think it's important to realize that Indiana's got a long way to go right now in terms of getting itself up to the point where it can compete at this level. Just to refresh everybody's memory, Indiana this year was 108th in offensive efficiency and 83rd in defensive efficiency. And that combination is not going to get the job done in terms of getting where Indiana claims it wants to be and getting where fans want to get to. And what's going to be fascinating for IU is, how do you turn your team into something that can compete at this level? It's probably too big of a stretch to say, well, we're going to get great in both of those areas. So can Indiana figure out a way to really concentrate on one side of the floor while not regressing too significantly on the other end of the floor? And in fact, they're still going to need to improve there. Even if you are one of these teams, like let's say you wanted to copy Illinois this year, it's a huge leap to go from 108th in offensive efficiency to first in offensive efficiency, especially when you're running the type of systems that Indiana has cared to run. But it's not entirely impossible, because I'll point out that Illinois last year was 68th in offensive efficiency, and they went from 68th to first in 1 year. And they did that largely through restructuring their roster. There was a really nice article that you should all check out in The Athletic. I think CJ Moore wrote it, talking about how Brad Underwood, after Illinois lost in the second round to Loyola of Chicago a few years ago, you may remember that, when Illinois was a 1 seed, he basically said, we're going to stop trying to focus on winning in the Big Ten. We're going to try instead to focus on winning in March. And so a lot of the changes that have been made in terms of Illinois strategy and style, in terms of the types of players they brought in, like Marcus Damask this year, have led directly to Illinois having that type of offensive system and being as efficient as they've been. Now, they sacrificed some stuff on the defensive end, and I would be nervous if I was an Illinois fan, because at some point that is going to come back and bite you when you play a team that can do both well, as opposed to just one. You're probably not going to be able, for instance, you could probably outscore Iowa State, which would be the next team that they have to play. You're not going to be able to just outscore Connecticut, who is likely who they play if they end up in the regional final. So these are some things to keep in mind as you think about what Indiana is doing in the portal. And, it's not impossible. It's what I keep saying. It is not impossible for Indiana to become better at offensive efficiency and defensive efficiency. That's what they're going to need to do to raise their overall profile. It's not just about getting dudes in the portal. It's about getting dudes that can contribute to a rising of the tide in terms of how efficient Indiana's playing. And that was really the big problem that they had this year, was that they were so inefficient. They leaked defensive possessions. They had so many wasted offensive possessions, oftentimes in a row. That's the kind of thing Indiana's got to address and fix. So as we see Indiana eventually dipping into the portal and bringing guys here to campus to fill out the roster, which has multiple open spots, think about the types of contributions that those players are going to make. Can they make Indiana a more efficient defensive team where they're stopping the opponent on a regular basis? Is that the direction IU goes? Does Indiana try to load up offensively and say, we need to score first and then we'll worry about defending later? It's going to be really fascinating to see. But you see the proof is in the pudding when you look at those numbers and you see which teams are still alive. It's either the teams that have high-level balance, or it's the teams that do one thing incredibly well and don't do the other thing so badly that they take themselves out of the situation. So that was issue 1 that I wanted to talk about. Issue 2 is a short one, and it's about Purdue's path. One of the funniest subplots to me over the course of this weekend was how the national media just absolutely wrapped poor Purdue in a blanket and was like, oh, this is so amazing. Look at what you did. You beat a 16 seed. I mean, if I was a Purdue fan, I would have been absolutely infuriated and insulted by the soft bigotry of low expectations being demonstrated by most of the people covering Purdue basketball. I mean, yes, Purdue lost to a 16 seed. It was the worst loss in NCAA tournament history. It was one of the worst losses and biggest upsets in the history of sports last year against Fairleigh Dickinson. But the idea that there was Iman Brennan, who I respect as a writer, but there was a tweet he had this morning where the title was, Houston hangs on and then Purdue destroys its demons. That's like, no. If Purdue destroyed its demons by beating a 16 seed and then running a pretty weak Utah State team out of a tremendously weak Mountain West, that's not destroying your demons. That's just getting to the second weekend, which for Purdue, who I think was the second odds-on favorite to win the entire NCAA tournament, if that's your demons, then I would really be cautious about what you're doing in the next round. People act like Purdue has never been able to get out of the first round before, which is just not true. 2 years ago, they made it to the Sweet 16. Everybody seems to think that the St. Peter's loss happened in the first round. No, St. Peter's beat Kentucky in the first round. They didn't beat Purdue until the Sweet 16. And people forget, like Purdue, they waxed Yale in the first round. They beat Texas by 10 points, and Texas was a really good team. Then they just went in and lost to St. Peter's in that Sweet 16 game. Now, Purdue does have a bit of a history of losing in the first round, but that's generally been as a lower seeded team. This is a Purdue program that went to 3 regionals in a row from 2016 to 2018. I just think it's hilarious given the coverage and the way that the narratives have kind of weaved around Purdue, that it's treated like some kind of big accomplishment emotionally and competitively that they got out of the first weekend. It's like you only need to go back 2 years for both of those things to happen. I just think the whole thing's hilarious. I will say, in terms of the general bracket, Purdue has a really curious path moving forward here. I actually would say that of the teams that are one of the 1 seeds, at least, pathway wise, they may have the most difficult one. Gonzaga, as I think they've demonstrated, especially with the way that they destroyed Kansas, Gonzaga is legit. As much as people kind of looked at Gonzaga and said this team can't get the job done, or they're overseeded or whatever, this is a Gonzaga team that is hyper efficient offensively. They are one of the most efficient offenses in the country. They're more efficient than Purdue. And if you look at them defensively, they're pretty okay. I mean, this is where I think they're probably going to struggle, but they're a top 50 defense. And again, I think the big question for them is going to be, can they do what they do well against Purdue? And what Gonzaga does well is they shoot the ball incredibly well, including from 3, and they don't turn the ball over. They're one of the best teams at holding on to the basketball. They're a relatively tall team, all things considered. They've got some height to throw at Edey. It's not the same level of height, but they're also a very smart team that has been conditioned against some of the best teams in the country, including Purdue, who they lost to by 10 points on a neutral floor back in November. If you get past Gonzaga, now Purdue has to play either Tennessee, again, a team that they beat earlier this year, although that was a pretty close game out in Maui, or they have to play against Creighton, a team that I personally think is really dangerous for Purdue to be playing, because Creighton is a really seasoned team that has that kind of inside-out combination that could give Purdue problems if the shots are falling. So, Purdue, I just think, I don't know if we're supposed to send them flowers because they got out of the first weekend. Congratulations, you've achieved absolute minimum expectations. I wish the national press would stop treating you with such kid gloves. Like, this should be the minimum expectation, not, well, we slayed our demons by not losing to a 16th seed. Like, congratulations, way to go. Anyway, last thing I want to hit this morning, the Dusty May saga. For those of you who were paying attention this weekend, Dusty May, former IU grad assistant and manager, head coach at Florida Atlantic. The hot rumor going into Saturday was that he was going to take the Louisville job. He ends up taking the Michigan job instead, signs a 5-year contract, and he's the new head coach at Michigan. This is an interesting thing for a number of levels. And there's like 3 different things I think that are worth touching on. The first one is that I think it's fascinating that Dusty May, if he indeed had the Louisville job in front of him, and every indication behind the scenes is that that was on the table, it was expected he was going to take the job, and then he essentially backed out. It's interesting watching Dusty May decide that he's going to go to go to Michigan instead of Louisville, because ultimately what you're dealing with at that point is someone who's decided that Michigan, with its own particular set of problems, is more attractive than what he's going to get at Louisville. And this is where I think the difference between these schools is really striking. Michigan, to some degree, I think is a much better fit for Dusty May than Louisville. But I would also say that I don't know that Dusty May would have been a great fit for Louisville, because if you look at the programs that are like Louisville, where, it's relatively low academic standards, they generally focus on a high level, very athletic recruits. Denny Crum did that stuff very well. And Denny Crum did all of that stuff in an era where he was using a lot of John Wooden's tactics, and did so to great effect. And it's not a criticism per se; it's just kind of a reality. You've also, however, got Rick Pitino, who was kind of in a similar vein. And Pitino had a very particular way of being able to get players and get a particular type of player to play well. I don't know that Louisville can really have the type of success they want building with underclassmen and trying to build players up through the regular style of, like, let's bring in a 3 or 4 star and gradually develop. And I'm not really sure that Dusty May is the type of coach who's going to be able to go out and get top level recruits and mesh them into a system every year. I do think that Dusty May fits really well at a Michigan, which has thrived largely under coaches who did take that second approach and were meshing together players who they were gradually developing, maybe sprinkle a transfer or two in. You look at the success John Beilein had there. It wasn't like he was doing all of that with 5 stars. He was doing it with sometimes lesser regarded recruits that he was able to plug into a system. And once that system got going in about 2012, it produced incredible results. A couple of Final Fours, and contention for Big Ten titles and things like that. That seems more like what Dusty May brings to the table, as opposed to, I'm going to go out and get a bunch of top-level recruits and make them work in this system. Michigan's got some flaws in terms of what it provides a coach. It doesn't have a lot of NIL money on the basketball side. It's pretty strict in terms of its academics on the basketball side. But I do think that Dusty May can work well within that environment. And obviously, as a former Hoosier, I wish him the best of luck as long as he's not playing Indiana. But I think that's about as good of a hire as Michigan probably could have gotten, given that the approach that they took with Juwan Howard and that type of roster building clearly had some limits at a place like Michigan. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. It's also no guarantee that Dusty May will necessarily succeed at the Big Ten level. One of the fascinating things to note right now is the number of coaches who don't have the type of sustained success at the Power 5 level that perhaps we would expect them to. That's a big leap. And the Big Ten is, it obviously is not having the type of high-level tournament success that the ACC has had, or some of the other conferences. The Big 12 certainly recently has been in this category. But it's an incredibly competitive conference with a very physical style of play that's difficult to integrate yourself into. So it's very curious to see how Dusty May does in this scenario. And I'll be anxious to see if what he did back at Florida Atlantic, if that can be translated to Michigan, or if he has to kind of start from scratch with his approach. The one other thing about this, obviously, and why I'm talking about it on this podcast, is there were a lot of IU fans that were very interested in potentially Dusty May being the next IU basketball coach. I will say, I don't think that that's out of the realm of possibility, even with him at Michigan. Only a 5-year contract, like whenever Mike Woodson were to move on, or when IU were to move on from Mike Woodson, a 5-year contract at that amount of money isn't an immense amount of money. And I'll note that we've seen coaches bounce relatively quickly when they get certain jobs, when other jobs become available. I mean, it's an interesting approach, because you think, oh, a guy signed somewhere and all of a sudden he's gone. We've seen coaches like Thad Matta is a good example. He got the Butler job, was there for 1 year, and then bounces to Xavier. He's only at Xavier for 3 years, ends up at Ohio State, and then has that great run at Ohio State from basically 2005 to 2015. So if you're like concerned as an IU fan because you were hoping Dusty May would be your coach someday, it could still happen. But obviously IU not changing coaches anytime soon. And perhaps this is good for Dusty May if these two parties were to ever get together in the future, to get a sense of what coaching was like at this level. Or he could create a great legacy for himself at Michigan, and maybe that just ends up being where he goes, which is essentially what happened with Bob Knight, if you recall, as Knight, not an IU guy, was an Ohio State guy, but made a home at IU and was there for 30 years. Same thing with Terry Morin, who went to school at Purdue, but has clearly made her own program here at Indiana. So going to be a lot to keep an eye on there. It'll be interesting, and curious to see what Louisville does now, as they are now fishing out of a completely different pond of prospects than what they perhaps thought they were going to be at the beginning. Anyway, that'll wrap it up for the show. My thanks to everybody for listening. As always, we'll have more podcast content throughout the course of the week. I'm Galen Clavio. This is Crimson Cast. We will catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.